Welcome to our session on Russia and Ukraine. My name is Sabah Nasri. I teach political science and political economy at York University, Toronto. I welcome all of you today. We have two presenters on the problematic transformation in Ukraine and Russia after the Soviet Union. First, we will start with Roger Annis. He is an independent researcher and a journalist. He will talk about class and nation in Ukraine. So, Roger, please.
I'm an editor of this website, The New Cold War, Ukraine and Beyond. The website was launched just about a year ago, following a conference in Crimea. And I attended a conference in Crimea in July of 2014, an anti-war conference that was organized by our colleague who's here with us today. We're very fortunate to have Boris Kagarlitsky here. And after this conference here in Winnipeg, he'll be traveling to Vancouver, Victoria, and then Toronto to give presentations on the present situation in Ukraine. So I'm very happy to be here with Boris. When I came back from Crimea in July of last year, I gave a presentation the following month in Ottawa, at the University of Ottawa, at the People's Social Forum. And that's when I met for the first time another colleague who's here today with us, Helena Makrishina, who's at the University of Ottawa and a teacher. And I must say, I don't know if I've ever told Helena this, but our work together, our collaboration together over the last more than a year has been extremely rewarding for me, and I'm extremely grateful for that collaboration that I've had with Helena, and I will say also with Boris, but also with so many other people that I have met through the course of writing about the situation in Ukraine as I see it. I see a tremendous default going on, certainly among mainstream media, but even among progressive opinion in Canada about the events in Ukraine. And this is what has motivated my writing and my activity over the last 18 months. I'm not an expert. I don't speak Russian. My trip to Crimea was my first time there, to that region of the world. So, I come to this issue with all of those limitations, but I think I also bring some decades of political activity and insight into the process as well. And so we began the website in the fall, and the website is an international collaboration which involves writers and editors from Ukraine, Russia, Australia, Canada, the United States. I'm missing a few countries, no doubt. Britain, very important one, because there's a very important movement of solidarity in Britain with the Ukrainian people. So it's been an extremely rewarding experience and continues to be so. I went to the region for the second time in April of this year. I went to Donetsk, and Helena and I both joined a media tour that was organized to bring people like us who are interested in writing about and informing the world of the situation in Ukraine. And so we went to Donetsk for 4 days in April of this year. That's the itinerary that we took on our journey, flying from Moscow to Rostov-on-Don and then proceeding from there by vehicle. So this is a very destructive policy by the Canadian government of isolation and confrontation with Russia, using the pretext of the war situation in Ukraine. And this policy needs to end. And this election campaign should be a moment for this policy at least to be debated seriously among the political parties in Ottawa. At least have a debate, but there is none. There's unanimity, and it's shameful, and it should end. And that's part of what I'm doing presently, is working with people in the Russian community. And I should say also in some people in the Ukrainian community who would simply like to have some serious public discussion on this issue, which we have not had in Canada to date. And so I feel that my 2 trips now to the region helped me a great deal in that regard. This is our delegation meeting with one of the person at the center of the photo here is Boris Litvinov, he's the director of the budget committee of the People's Republic of Donetsk. That was one of many, many informative visits we had during our 4 days in Donetsk. And the most important thing that we did is we went to the regions of Donetsk City, we're in Donetsk City here, that are most affected by the war. That is, they're on the front line of the demarcation line, close to the airport in Donetsk. And these are people whose houses are being regularly, have been until the September 1st ceasefire, regularly shelled and bombed by the Ukrainian armed forces and by the right-wing militias with which the Ukrainian armed forces are allied. Now, I want to start today by saying, I'm quite happy with things as they stand presently in eastern Ukraine. We've had a ceasefire in effect since September 1st, and this is really it's a renewal, or we could say an application of the ceasefire that was agreed to on February 12th of this year by the Ukrainian government with the rebel forces in eastern Ukraine, and this is being mediated by the governments of Germany, France, and Russia. But Ukraine has not respected that ceasefire. And the most important condition of all of the ceasefire is that the Ukrainian government talk with the rebel forces of eastern Ukraine and reach a political agreement that both sides can live with to put an end to the war and try to come to some agreement on the political and economic issues that are at dispute. And the Ukrainian government has not made a step in that direction. But it has been compelled by the events of the past few months to accept a ceasefire, which it was supposed to do back in February 12th, didn't do, and this is what we saw when we were in Donetsk in April, but I'm very happy to say that today, as of September 1st, the ceasefire now is holding, and that's very encouraging, so now we can begin to build on that. Now, I'm not going to have time to give you a broad overview of the origin of the war in Ukraine as I see it, and I think actually my colleague Anna is going to do quite a bit more on that than I'll do in this shorter presentation. But if you'd like to view the longer presentation that I gave following our return from Donetsk this year, then you can go to our website and look in the video section of the website and find my presentation there, because I do go into quite a bit of detail there of the history of the conflict, the situation in Crimea, which I won't have any time to deal with today, and lots of other issues of language, culture, national rights in Ukraine, and so forth. I'm really, I guess today you could say, giving you a bit of a shorter version of what I presented a few months ago, but of course updated by very important developments, most notably the ceasefire of September 1st, but others as well. Now, my view of the Euromaidan movement, as it's called, is that this is a very complex phenomenon. As we know, what came into power in February of 2014 in Ukraine was a right-wing neoconservative government. That's what I call it. Others have different descriptions of it. But of course, which was also allied closely in politics with extreme right forces, including neo-Nazi forces. This is what came into power in February of 2014 in Ukraine. But of course, that doesn't mean that everyone that was out on Maidan Square was supporting this kind of government. What happened was a very aggressive intervention by neoconservative and right-wing, extreme right-wing forces to turn this Maidan movement towards the type of pro-European Union and pro-austerity policies that it represents, because the two go hand in hand now. If you support the European Union as it exists today, that means you're supporting harsh austerity policies as well. But that doesn't mean that everyone at Maidan Square had this in mind. The interests that were present on Maidan Square were complex. They were sometimes conflicting as well. But what came out of that, the end result of that, is a right-wing government in power in Ukraine. But it's very important for us to understand this right-wing government does not have the universal support of the Ukrainian people. Ukraine is deeply divided precisely over the course of this government, and significant numbers of Ukrainian people, not just in the east of the country, but elsewhere as well, oppose austerity, oppose the hostile attitude to Russia that this new government has. They certainly oppose the war, the civil war in the east of the country that this new government has been perpetrating, and so on. So we're dealing with a very complex phenomenon at all levels here. And it's very important to keep in mind what is really driving the war situation in Ukraine is not just internal to Ukraine. The member governments of the NATO military alliance have been aggressively pursuing a course of confrontation and pressuring and cajoling and even threatening the Ukrainian government to sustain and deepen this course of confrontation with Russia. So it's very important to keep in mind the aggressive foreign interests that are at play in Ukraine. And, this is one map that says it all. This is the expansion of NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, which the member countries of the NATO alliance said they would never do. They said, don't worry, the new Russia, don't worry, we're not going to take advantage of your chaos and the collapse of the existing political order to advance our own interests. And they lied from the get-go. They never intended to build a new and peaceful Europe. They intended to take advantage of Russia's moment of weakness and disarray, and that's precisely what they've done, and Ukraine is just the latest step in this step by step. You see by the colorations here, the different dates of advance of NATO towards the east. So Ukraine is just it's the new color here. They haven't quite added you'll see Ukraine is still in color white here on the map, but you could put a new color there for NATO's ultimate intentions. Now, whether they'll get to a situation where they will have this country of Ukraine as a NATO member, we'll see. That's far from certain or far from determined in advance. But this is the reality underlying the conflict in Ukraine more than anything else. Or let's put that differently. This is one of the two realities underlying the conflict in Ukraine. The other part of the reality is the aggressive policy and intentions of the Ukrainian government itself. And there's a commonality of interest going on here. Although in the course of this confrontation, this independent country of Ukraine is becoming more and more subordinated to the imperialist powers to its west, represented above all by the NATO military alliance. And that's an important part of this story. Now, what we know less of in the events over the last 18 months is the protest movement, which is called anti-Maidan, or it's called the Russian Spring, but the protest movement that sprung up across Ukraine, and not just in the east, not just in Donetsk and Lugansk, but also in Odessa. Everywhere you see in this map, basically this is the coloration of the very significant protest movement that rose up and said, whoa, wait a sec, we don't agree with this course of orientation towards austerity Europe. We don't want a hostile policy towards our neighbor country, Russia. We don't want to see this militarization of Ukrainian society, this ambition of joining NATO. And so what was the attitude of this new Ukrainian government to that? Did they say, oh, well, half of our citizenry doesn't agree with our course. We have to talk about this. We have problems here that we should try and resolve. No. The attitude of this new Ukrainian government was put up and shut up. This is where we're going. We're going to become an anti-Russia, pro-EU, and pro-NATO country. And if you don't like it, it doesn't matter. You don't have a voice anymore. And furthermore, if you protest in the streets, we're going to send violent people to suppress this. And that's precisely what was done in Ukraine in the weeks and months following the overthrow of the government in February of 2014, including this was intended in Crimea. And the reason why Crimea was able to step aside and avoid the course of civil war was because it was the only part of Ukraine that had its own autonomous political authority. It had an autonomous government in in Crimea. And this elected government, part of the Ukrainian constitutional setup, organized a referendum in March of 2014 and said, we're not going to be part of this future Ukraine. In fact, we have a lot of historical grievances that we've not been able to resolve because Ukraine has not been a democratic space to do it, and we're going to resolve it now. So, in a nutshell, that's what happened in Crimea. Now, there's a certain tragedy to the Russian Spring, which is that in all these areas here that are colored, where the opposition to the Ukrainian government was strongest, there's only one part or two parts, shall we say, Donetsk and Lugansk, where the people became well enough organized to actually resist this right-wing government, resist its militarization, and resist its violent attacks on them. They were not so lucky in places like Odessa and Kharkiv. The level of political organization of the masses was not sufficient. It was in Donetsk and Lugansk. That's partly due to the proximity to the Russian border for sure. It's also due to the geographic distance from Kiev. It took longer for Kiev's paramilitary battalions to arrive in this part of the country and suppress the people who were saying we want dialogue, not confrontation. That's why you had the rebellion successful in the most eastern parts. And of course, there's historical reasons too. This part of Ukraine is there's a deeper, you could say, I think, a historical and political consciousness there. But all of these regions that you see colored had significant opposition to this change of course by the new Ukrainian government, but they were not able to organize quickly enough and effectively enough to resist the violent assault by the new right-wing government. And so this is the tragedy of the Russian Spring, is that they are now captive outside of Donetsk and Lugansk. The people of Ukraine are captive to this right-wing government, and it's very difficult to protest today. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult to protest. And so this issue will be resolved in the months and several years ahead, because these people will be heard. They will not be excluded from whatever Ukraine becomes. So the anti-Maidan rebellion, it's a very complex thing. And this is something that, analysts in the Western imperialist countries really need to sit down and spend some time understanding, because it's not simple and it has its own unique characteristics. These are the 4 essential characteristics that I see in my understanding of the rebellion that's taken place across southern and eastern Ukraine. These could also be used to describe parts of Crimea as well. There's a lot of important distinctions about Crimea that make it unique, including how it succeeded in avoiding civil war. But I don't have time to go into those. But these are 4 really important characteristics for understanding what's fundamental about the rebellion. Now, this doesn't describe it overall. The rebellion overall, there's no one term that describes it. And within, this generally positive picture that I present here, there's lots of complications. And there's political forces involved in the rebellion that I wouldn't necessarily even share, but I think the overall trend is we're looking at a positive, popular reaction to a violent, right-wing, reactionary, conservative regime in Kiev. And this movement of opposition deserves support across the board because of what it is fundamentally. And these key demands of the Russian Spring movement, now this is at the origin of the Russian Spring movement. Things have changed because the Civil War changes things. And so the issue now of having real political, certainly autonomy, if not independence, is very much on the minds now of people in Donetsk and Lugansk and in these other regions where they have not been so successful in resisting Kiev. So none of this is frozen in time. But when you look at the key demands of the Russian Spring at the outset, you see something roughly not dissimilar to the constitutional setup of Canada, where we have provincial governments that have substantial, not just economic powers that they exercise, including the taxation even, but they exercise significant cultural and language policies. Province of Quebec being the best example, but this province here of Manitoba being another one. That's roughly what the people in eastern Ukraine wanted. Not very radical on the world scale of things, but way too radical for the Kiev government and way too radical for the NATO countries, including Canada, that's not prepared to have Ukraine with a constitutional setup similar to Canada's own constitution. They want a Ukraine that's subordinate and really a neo-colony of the West. Now, I want to just say a few words about what I think Ukraine is, because this is a subject that requires a lot more attention by scholars, but also by political activists. Ukraine is a country. Now, that may not sound too controversial to you, but among some people in the world, that's controversial, because there's a view that Ukraine is really not a country. It's this strange construct that emerged out of the Soviet Union and, is not really independent anymore. Maybe it never was, and so on and so forth. So, this, which I won't go through point by point, but affirms that this is a profoundly important country with a deep and profound history, cultural, linguistic, and otherwise. And I think that this needs to be recognized as we take account of going forward in Ukraine. And this is just one little map to show you the complexity of the country that we're talking about. This is nothing similar to Canada, for example. We have a significant French language minority here, but the role of the French language in Canada pales in comparison to the role of the Russian language in Ukraine, and that's not a problem. It's a great thing to have a country like Ukraine with many languages and many cultures and even varying histories depending on the region of the country. Nothing wrong with that at all. This is something we can build on. On the contrary, this is good, but it's complicated and it requires complicated political resolution. And here's another map that gives you an idea of the complexity of the country that we're talking about. Ukraine only came together 100 years ago from very sort of disparate backgrounds. And we met people in Donetsk earlier this year who said, why the heck did we become part of Ukraine back in 1918? Because that was these borders were initially the consequence of the Russian Revolution of 1917. Very progressive borders in their time. But there's people in Donetsk today say we should have been part of Russia from the beginning, and we never would have these problems today. So it just gives you a small illustration of the complications that we're talking about. So what is Russia? This is the most misunderstood question of all in the present conflict, by far. I mean, Ukraine's a complicated place and hard to understand, but the misunderstanding and the abuse of the presentation of Russia across the political spectrum, I'm sorry to say, including on the left, is just, it's overwhelming. We're talking about one of the biggest countries in the world, well, geographically largest country in the world, a major military power, the largest combined oil and gas producer in the world, and obviously a major country in the politics of the world. But what is it? And the answer to that question that we get? Phrases. Russia's imperialist, Russia's aggressive, Russia's bad, Russia's good. Where's the analysis of what is this country? It's 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Is it a capitalist country? I think most people agree on that. Is it a progressive country? Wildly different views on that. But the biggest question of all, I think that those of us on the left have to answer is it an imperialist country or not? Because first of all, you have to know what you're talking about if you're going to make a serious analysis of a political conflict. But depending on what your analysis is, there are consequences. Countries act according to what the very nature of their economic and social condition is. And I make a forceful argument, and other colleagues with the New Cold War website make a forceful argument that no, Russia is not a capitalist country. Now, many people jump simplistically to the conclusion, oh my goodness, Roger Annis or the New Cold War website is that Russia is sort of a progressive country in the world playing a very progressive role. Well, why would you conclude that? Let's talk substantially of what Russia's role is. In the case of the conflict in eastern Ukraine, yes, Russia's playing a progressive role because it's refusing to obey NATO's orders and accept whatever NATO wants it to do. Don't support Crimea, turn your back on the rebellion in eastern Ukraine, don't support the rebels in eastern Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Well, Russia's not prepared to do that. Hallelujah. When have we seen governments in the world with the will to stand up to imperialist diktats? Why would we not welcome this? Now, does this mean that Russia is today's capitalist Russia, is a model for social development, either for the Russian people or others in the world? Well, I don't think so. I'm a socialist. I want to see a socialist Russia in which, the wealth is truly shared among all the population. And of course, Russia already does this, but we want Russia to be more of solving the problems of underdevelopment in the world and also the ecological emergency that we're in the world. So that's what I think in Russia. But that doesn't mean I'm going to just have some blind phrase to understand the country. And I'm certainly not going to misrepresent what Russia's role has been in Ukraine. Russia's role has been primarily reactive to an offensive by NATO and by this right-wing government. So I don't see the problem in saying that. The world's a complicated place and nothing is black and white. And I think when you get into the substance of the matter, which I can only do here in these point forums, you see that Russia is a very different place than the imperialist countries, the countries of North America, Europe, and Asia. And I have a convenient little map here. I mean, here's the imperialist division of the world. Dark red this is a pretty good measure of the social reality of the countries in the world today. And those that are colored here in red are the ones that have very significant levels of wealth and development, greater than all the other countries. And you can see that Russia, in terms of per capita wealth, which is a very important measure of a country, is not even in second tier in the world. There's the orange second tier that you see there. It actually includes Libya, which would not be the case anymore today. But Russia is actually in the third tier. Its per capita wealth is comparable to, I mentioned in a note here, to South Korea and Brazil. It's far from anything in North America, Europe, and in Asia there. So this is what we have to understand, because if we understand what Russia is, then we have a lot easier time interpreting events in Ukraine. But if we come to this issue with phrases that Russia is imperialist, well, then it's pretty easy to make the leap to say, well, whatever they're doing in Ukraine must be bad because they're imperialist, right? And whoa, end of discussion. You call it a serious discussion? You call that serious analysis? No, and this is part of what we need to turn around in the Western countries is let's have some serious discussion about what Russia is, and let's get rid of the phrasing that is used to simplify a complex problem. So what do I think are the prospects? Well, I wrote these notes roughly 3 months ago after returning from Donetsk, and I wouldn't change them that much. Even though it might be a desirable outcome to see Donbass stand as an independent republic, and certainly many people there would want to see that. I think that might win a majority of votes today if there were a referendum in Donetsk and Lugansk. I think a majority would vote for some kind of independent republic, but only because Russia won't accept them, as Russia did with Crimea. And that's for a host of different reasons. Well, you can imagine what would happen to Russia on the world stage if it were to accept Donetsk and Lugansk, as it did in Crimea. Russia did the right thing in Crimea. It respected the will of the Crimean people. Unfortunately, it's in a much more difficult situation to do that today if there were a referendum and if a majority said, we want to join the Russian Federation. So, that's kind of off the table. So now we're talking about what's the best possible arrangement with this Ukraine that Donbass is part of. And I think the best arrangement is, to come to some political agreement with Kyiv. Now, that's going to be very difficult to do because this, as I said, the government in Kyiv is still not talking to the rebels. So it's easy for us to theorize what an ideal settlement would be. This first one is probably the most realistic, but we cannot say with confidence that it would actually happen. And then the other alternatives that I point to are there, but I think we're less likely to see in a short term, even if, I could be convinced in theory that, an independent Donbass or even this new entity called Novorossiya, after which people, certainly a strong minority of people in the east and south of Ukraine would like to give serious consideration to that. But unfortunately, the world is not a very fair place today, and people don't get a free choice on what they want. They're usually stuck with, something less than what they would like, and that's certainly the case for people in Ukraine today. So what should we do in the face of all this? Well, I think we have some pretty simple and straightforward tasks. We have to be active politically to oppose this intervention by the NATO powers in Ukraine and against Russia. And that means opposing the economic sanctions against Russia. It's a scandal, and I'll repeat it again, it's a scandal that the political left in most of the advanced capitalist countries of the world don't even talk about the sanctions regime against Russia. This regime should be opposed. There should be no sanctions against Russia. Sanctions are just a step towards war. That's always the role that they played in history, and we should stop that and cut it off. And of course, as I've already said, we should support real, genuine autonomy for the people of Ukraine. And we have a particular task in Canada, which a lot of people younger than me will seem coming out of the blue, Canada out of NATO. This was the policy of the New Democratic Party until only about 10 years ago it was changed. We need to put that back on the political agenda. Canada should be out of NATO. This is why we should be concerned about Ukraine. This is where this thing is going if we don't stop this NATO offensive. And you know what? The United States is renewing its storehouse of 20 nuclear weapons in Germany presently as we speak. They're putting in more modern nuclear. What on earth do they have in mind? Well, use your imagination. They've done it twice in history already, in the United States, that is. But the other very compelling reason why we have to be acting against the war in Ukraine is we have a much bigger problem in the world today. It's even bigger than militarism, large as that is. We have a climate emergency on our hands. And why are we wasting time with war and confrontation in Eastern Europe? And why are we destroying the countries of the Middle East with war? And why is there so much difficulty and misery in the world when we should be coming together rapidly to tackle the climate emergency, which is not in the future. It's happening now. The refugees in their millions, that's coming, and we'll have to get ready for that. The people living at sea level who are going to have to move. The countries whose food production patterns are going to change vastly because of changing weather patterns. We've got to get ready for that. We've got to be talking about that right now. But what are we doing? These imperialist powers are wasting our time and our resources with military confrontation. So this is the course that we need, and I'm more confident than I was 18 months ago that we can see down the road a political resolution to the conflict in Ukraine, which would be great for the people of Ukraine. But this task of creating a world of justice and a world that begins to tackle the climate emergency, that's before all of us. And I think part of getting to that is opposing every one of these military adventures by the imperialist powers, so we could really be focusing our time and energies on what's important in the world. So thanks so much for your time and patience.